Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is another remix episode where we revisit previous guests and explore a topic they all discussed. This one is about the hot topic of EV adoption. There's a lot of attention about EVs today, and rightly so. It will someday impact all Canadians. The targets began for the 2026 model year, requiring that at least 20% of new light-duty vehicles sold in that year be electric. The requirements increase annually to 60% in 2030 and 100% by 2035. This is a contentious topic that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Interesting. Now, when someone is looking or studying EV adoption, the numbers don't lie. When you're looking at data points, they're very important. So, what are your thoughts on the business, of electrification?
Yeah, I think like any business or any predictive model or indices, it's like, okay, it's going to fall somewhere in this spectrum. So right now, and I get, why there's short sellers and naysayers in the space because it is such a broad sensitivity analysis on what adoption looks like. So right now, I think we're in a bit of a negative news cycle around EVs because maybe some of the bullish targets weren't hit for the 2023. So just going back to your question on the numbers, I think we're around 10.5 million cars globally in 2022 were zero emission vehicles or battery electric vehicles, BEV as they're known as. This year we're at 18 million. So it is a massive increase by most people's measurements. But the US, for example, I think was hitting a 70% year over year growth and they only hit a 50. So all of a sudden, you'll get some negative market speculation around that, but there's also people with a vested interest, in electrification not moving at the pace they want it to, whether they're in an industry that is counter to it or it threatens that industry, or it's strictly an investment thing. They have short positions in some of these stocks related to electrification. But yeah, the numbers themselves don't lie. We were up, like I said, 18% of all vehicles sold globally were zero emission vehicles or battery electric vehicles last year. And the compounded year over year growth rate is just exponentially going up every year. So where does it fall in that spectrum? Somewhere maybe in the middle of the bull end or the bear end, but it's still moving at a pace that you can't deny. It's coming. It's just a question of how fast it's coming. Those are strictly the numbers, like the free market numbers. Then you also have regulatory capture that's pushing it too, because you have governments across the world. If you look at the Kyoto Accord agreement, everyone who has signed on to the Paris Climate Deal or the Kyoto Accord has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's target thresholds within there. So if you just take the Canadian government or the US government, essentially we've committed that by 2035 in the light duty vehicle sector, we will not sell anything but a zero emission vehicle.
So around the area of awareness and education, how do you help your clients understand the financial advantages to EV adoption? Because it can be an investment, it can be costly. So how do you go around that?
Yeah, I'd say we tackle this on sort of two different levels because, so our work, we're generally working for governments and utilities that are trying to figure out what kind of a role they can play in this transition and how they can accelerate adoption of electric vehicles. Sometimes that's within their own operations. Maybe it's a government or utility that has their own fleet of vehicles, private companies as well. And in those cases, sometimes we're helping them to develop a plan that makes the case for investment in electric vehicles. And it's all about getting a sense of, what is it going to involve in terms of those upfront capital investments for the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. But what's the prize at the end of the tunnel in terms of reduced operational costs? And I think for those fleet customers, we're in luck because a lot of fleets, do a lot of this kind of analysis and using spreadsheets to look at the total cost of ownership. And that really helps make a pretty compelling case for electric vehicles. But for the other side of the work, which is actually the majority of our work, is when we're helping governments and utilities understand the potential for transitioning to EVs region-wide, not just in their own operations, but say for a provincial government, how do they accelerate adoption across the whole province? And there again, this question of awareness and understanding of the financial implications of switching to an EV are very important. We all know that EVs currently cost more upfront. They might save you in the long run, depending on what type of driving you do. But average people are much less likely to use a spreadsheet to calculate their total cost of ownership. We know that personal vehicle decisions are a lot less rational and scientific. Folks are looking at that upfront sticker price. And so I think beyond looking at just the total cost of ownership, that's certainly a part of the puzzle. Certainly, governments across the country are doing their best to improve the awareness and do a lot of education around those types of benefits of EVs. But at the same time, we know that upfront cost is really an important barrier to adoption. And so I think that's where, for some of our clients, whether it's governments at the federal level or provincial level, things like financial incentives are a really important piece of the puzzle to help deal with that upfront cost, at least temporarily, while the cost of these vehicles is still, significantly higher than comparable gas-powered vehicles.
Recent news has told us that EV adoption is cooling a little bit. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, this is a very hard thing to do. Car sales in general ebb and flow. And I think everybody is always looking to see that how the naysayers always want to say, oh, look, it's not working. Now people aren't buying EVs. Some of it's just a change in the marketplace. But the other thing is, when you say that to me, I think you're thinking, well, in your backyard, like in Canada and in the US, things seem to be quiet, slow. The adoption's not very good. Except if we look, adoption is not car manufacturers don't manufacture cars for one area. They manufacture cars for the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So if you went to Norway as an example, and I think you already know this, that adoption there is at 91.5% now. So you would see a completely different arrangement. And even in Canada, if you went to BC or to Quebec, where the government is really behind these things, you'll see way more vehicles. I think, and I mean, there's people are saying that this coming year is actually going to be a very good year for vehicles. We have new vehicles coming out from manufacturers that we hadn't seen, the quantity of them, the different kinds and different price ranges. So I don't think, and listen, it doesn't seem at all possible to me that this clock is somehow going to stop or turn back, and somebody will go, you know what, we really made a mistake. These gasoline burning vehicles, this was the state of the art. I can't believe that we imagined to go to electric vehicles. It's impossible. It's just, I think for you and I, this has moved slower than we thought it would. We always think we're in it. We think it's great, and we can't imagine why everybody else isn't. But once we reach past people that are have home charging, it's a little more challenging. What are they going to do? How are they going to charge it? So we're in that sort of second phase. I think things like we talked about, the NACS connector and better public charging, and everybody, now that the cars are there, making the batteries better, making the range better, making the charging faster, making everything easier, all of this will come together. If I could tell you tomorrow that you could charge your car exactly the way you filled it with gas, that on every fourth corner there's going to be a place to charge, it'll only take you 5 minutes. There is no possible way that you would buy a gasoline car because it doesn't make any sense at all. The maintenance is far too high. There's too much oil changes, let alone the, God help me, that we're moving from burning fossil fuels. I mean, this is, almost secondary to some people, but the whole thing is better. I just need to get this piece into their heads and get this working. And people can't build better batteries and better charging if they don't have customers. And now we're getting enough customers. So it's always a little bit of a chicken and egg, and it has its moments where it gets a little slower. But I really don't see any other possibility. But for this, it's certainly in the for people's cars. Large trucking may be a different story. We may have to figure out other ways, or it may adapt over time as well. People are working on it, but for the cars, I think the ship has sailed already. We're absolutely going in that direction, and I wouldn't worry about what it seems to you like a temporary slowdown. And I don't, to be perfectly honest with you, don't believe everything you hear in the news. The news has a particular bent that they want to talk about, not every car catches on fire. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
if if it bleeds, it leads, right? So I, I think we have to take, and certainly in China, the cars there's an unbelievable adoption of vehicles that you just don't see them because they haven't worked out here, come here because of tariffs and other things. But this is going to work itself out.
Can you describe the concept around load balancing for, for multi-unit buildings, like multiple chargers plugged into the same network?
Yes. Yeah, that's an important one. It's something like I'll hear frequently in conversation or, just reading on the subject. People are always worried about the grid. Like,
Right.
okay, cool. You want everyone in North America or globally to drive a battery electric vehicle, but our grid can't support it. That's the most common thing that I'll hear or you may hear. And the numbers don't really support that. But the reality is a bit different. I'll speak to it in this way. Right now, if we want to electrify 100% of the light duty vehicles in North America, we only need about 15% more energy on the grid. So if you turn on every single production facility and every single peaker plant, so every generating station and every what we call peaker plant or peak demand response, if you just maxed out energy production right now in North America, to electrify the transportation system, we only need about 15% more energy. The problem is the reality of the math, the math doesn't line up with the reality, which is people want to charge when they want to charge. So right now, because the grid was built for like Christmas Day and, Thanksgiving, everyone's home, everyone's cooking, the heat's on, the lights are on, like that's how much power we have on the grid. But if you can convince people to change their charging habits or use charging habits that match unused headroom on the grid, which is typically at night, right? People are doing less things, so the grid demand is lower at night. So if we can, one, convince people, A, to charge at night, or put what we call DERMS programs in place, distributed energy resource management systems, where utilities can actually control EVs and EV charging loads on the grid, then all of a sudden that 15%, additional power becomes a viable goal, because now we're talking about things like renewable energy, solar, wind. There's a lot of ways to get to that 15%. So one, controlling charging habits gets us there. And the other thing that you said that you and I talked about is load management. So actually managing these loads within the building, because the average Canadian only drives about 50 or 60 kilometers a day. On a level 2 charger, like I talked about with the stove,
Right.
plug, that much energy, that's only about 2 to 3 hours of charge time per night. So if I come home, let's take an apartment building, which is a prime example, because 40% of Canadians don't own their home. 31% of Canadians live in a multi-unit residential building. So 3 units are up. Let's say I come home to my apartment building and I get home at 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night. I don't leave the next day to 7, 8, 9 o'clock the next day. So I've got a 12-hour window where my vehicle's parked and plugged in.
Right.
If I was going to dedicate one breaker, one circuit, one outlet for that charger, the load calculation on the building, so the amount of energy you'd have to bring in that building to support that 1-to-1 ratio is astronomical. But now all of a sudden, if I can put 4, 5, or 6 chargers all on the same circuit, but through software control them, so ultimately if the homeowner comes home at that 5, 6, 7 and they wake up at 7, 8, 9 and their vehicle's charged back to 100%, that's the experience they care about. They don't care that maybe it took 4 or 5 or 6 times longer to get there. So that's the idea of load balancing, and that's some of the nuances around getting the grid to the point where it needs to be. Ultimately, an electrified transportation system creates a more robust grid. When you start talking about things like bidirectional charging, where, okay, not only can I draw energy into my battery from the grid, but during grid events, demand events, what Halifax is like with our storms, during power outages, if I could also return that energy from my battery back to my home, back to the grid, it actually creates a more robust grid and a better system and experience for everybody.
So if I was a multi-unit owner, of a building, and I was considering putting in some charging units, what are some of the myths or some of the misconceptions that you might come across?
I think one of the big ones, or one of the big concerns, I don't know about misconception, is just like a way to recoup the cost, because the developers we work with are concerned about putting charging infrastructure in, because once you get above what we would deem a low rise, so let's say 5 stories, once you're below a 5-story apartment building, those are typically easier to deploy EV charging infrastructure in, because you have like the individual meters for each unit or each suite down in the parking garage.
Mm-hmm.
So there's systems where you can tap in to the tenant or the condo owner's meter, and all that charging energy can just go right on their, let's say, Nova Scotia Power bill or Power bill. So those are kind of easy. Where it becomes hard, and one of the myths that I run into with developers, once you get into high rises, so there's no longer meters in the parking garages. They put them up on the individual floors to lower the cost of the electrical infrastructure. Now they're trying to figure out, well, hey, I only have what we deem a house meter. So I, the developer, own that meter with my power, with my utility. And I need to weigh, I'm buying that energy at 12, 13, 15, 20, depending what market you're in, 30 cents a kilowatt hour. How do I bill my tenants for that energy? So that's one myth, like the ability to do that and recoup those costs. So that's where like smart or commercial charging infrastructure starts to make sense in those applications, where you can actually, there's metering systems in the chargers. So you can buy the energy from your utility at 15, 20, 30 cents a kilowatt hour, and you can resell that to your tenant. And now all of a sudden you've got an ROI. One, you've got an amenity, and maybe you have an amenity in that space to differentiate yourself as a developer. But then two, you've got an ROI or a payback scheme for that CapEx and of course the OpEx to maintain that hardware. So that's a big one. People don't think it can be done. And then two, the other one you and I touched on is they just don't think the service will support it, the electrical service in their building. So, they just wash their hands of it because it's too complicated. But that's where things like load balancing come into play, which we just touched on, where you put more chargers on the existing circuitry that you have in the building, or going a level up. We also have a monitoring system. There's a monitoring system where you can monitor the power coming into the building, and you can correlate that to the amount of load going into the EV charging. So you can ensure you're always using that unused electrical headroom, if you will, in the building, and apply that to vehicles. So there's a whole lot of cool schemes most people aren't even aware of, where they can add much more EV charging infrastructure, not only to apartment buildings, commercial fleet applications, without getting into really costly service or electrical upgrades.
What about electric fleets? I mean, there are transportation, there are buses. I think there's an electric ferry that is in the works. It's under development right now. Of course, there's the infrastructure that has to support all of that. So where is the municipality in that?
Yeah, our council adopted our electric vehicle strategy for the city just over a year ago, and it deals with our corporate fleet. So we have about 300 some vehicles, police cars, fire trucks, all the. I guess this strategy is just for light duty fleet. So sorry, not the fire trucks, but some of the fire vehicles that go to emergencies, like the supervisor vehicles and police cars, and then, all the kind of by law enforcement vehicles, all those things. So we have a plan to fully convert all of them to being electric by 2030. And the costs and benefits of doing that, there's actually a financial bonus to doing that over time. It actually should save the city money. And then there's another piece to the strategy on the charging infrastructure. And we have just launched an RFP for actually getting a bunch of public chargers installed across the city to have a really connected network of chargers, because we don't want people waiting in line for charging. We don't want people to have to drive out of their way for charging. But that requires all kinds of things you don't think about at first, like a policy on what to charge, a bylaw on what to charge. So, we were working with legal and our IT team and our risk and insurance team, all to come up with this recommendation that will go to council for approval shortly on what to charge for the ones that we're installing. And then we're trying to encourage other organizations to put chargers in as well, not just the city itself. And the other piece of the strategy is on education and awareness and capacity building. And we're working with Clean Foundation. They have a really cool program called Next Ride, and you can test drive any electric vehicles that they have. And they're a wealth of information about what it's like to own and operate an electric vehicle. And they run education campaigns and do little mobile test drives and stuff all over the province. So that's kind of where we are with that. And then we're about to get our first our first bunch of electric buses really soon. There's one in town where we got to go out on a little test drive just last week, actually, with the Nova bus, which is the type of electric bus that we've purchased. And they're working on getting the chargers in the bus depot to support all of that work. And yeah, so we're definitely getting there.
Yeah, the infrastructure, pun intended, but, a bumpy ride a little bit and a couple of potholes thrown in there. So, which all comes from rapid growth in the industry, right?
That's
but
right.
Where would you say, the industry is right now for EVs, like on the consumer side, but also the commercial side?
It's definitely growing. It hasn't really stopped growing, which is a great thing. So it's been growing more and more and more intensely, even pre-COVID. It really coalesced with the introduction of the Model 3, and that really was the first mass market car that the mass market consumer could see themselves driving. So that was definitely an inflection point in the industry, and that's continued on through all the unfortunate events of COVID over the past few years, and it's kept growing steadily, but it hasn't been without its fair share of bumps and potholes, like you said, especially as Nova Scotians. We're used to a bit of a bumpy ride here domestically on our roads, but it has been a topsy-turvy few years in the vehicle industry generally, but compoundedly so with respect to electric vehicles. Again, everything from supply numbers to price drops in the market from Tesla and how that affects and snowballs through the rest of the industry. There's those things that are happening, as well as a massive build out in charging infrastructure, more makes and models on the road than ever before, and more variety for the consumer than ever before. So it's sort of like this yin and yang of real concrete challenges on the road to mass adoption, and all of this suite of innovation that has happened, even to bring us to bear to this point. It's been quite a ride for sure, but it's been a lot of fun, and I see a little bit of risk in the future, but definitely much more opportunity.
The consumer attitudes or the behaviors towards EVs, it came from a point, and we were both early adopters with EVs, where it came from curiosity. It's like, oh wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
To now, it's shifting towards, it's kind of a must-have. It's money saving. It's a little costly up front, but the savings over time, it pays off. Would you say
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's along that line?
Yeah, absolutely. The economics are undeniable, and I'm sure that just to recite the example of Hertz, I'm sure that's why Hertz ordered so many direct from Tesla, a year and a half ago, and of course the amount that are being sold now back into the market is substantially less than they bought. So are people taking the bait? Well, yes, I think so. It's not a complete, rosy picture. There's up and down. It's like a stock ticker. It's a noisy function, but it is trending in the right direction, undeniably.
You mentioned Hertz just a minute ago. So let's talk about EVN, the electric vehicle network,
Yes,
which you have, and the concept behind it, and also, the cool features about your mobile app. You're changing the way people rent cars now.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you for that. It's definitely been an entrepreneurial journey and a half, for sure. So EVN, short for Electric Vehicle Network, I co-founded this company back in 2019 with my partner Daryl Croft, who was the chairman of OK Tire, Coast to Coast. So he came at it from a perspective of electric vehicles are really easy to maintain.
In the introduction, I talked a little bit about, Upcycle green technology and the innovative things that you're doing. But tell me a little bit more about, how it all began, and especially in PEI.
So I decided to move to Canada 5 years ago, my wife and I, to decide to move. And we went to Summerside in PI. We got an endorsement letter from there. And we're in a PNP program. And when you arrived there, our goal was to open a very simple business, a natural food store, something like that. But when you had the first meeting with the officers of the city, they look at our backgrounds, our resumes, and they thought maybe we could do something different, especially because I had some experience in electrification of cars, and they would like to electrify their fleet. So the Upcycle start this like this.
Definitely. Now, walk us through the process of taking a 2009 to 2013 Corolla, and maybe explain why you choose that year and model. But walk us through the process of those cars and how you convert them into an EV truck.
Okay, so one of the things that you realize is to have a competitive price to make the electrification of the cars, we need to make a serial production of these cars. So we started looking after what car should be the best alternative for us. And the best selling cars in Canada with kind of 15 years, that was our target, was the Corolla, the Honda Civic, the Hyundai Elantra, and the Volkswagen Jetta Golf. We make a lot of research about the pros and cons of each one of these cars, and in the end we decide to use the Corolla, especially because they are very resistant to the rust underneath the car, and it's a very big problem here in Canada. We don't have this in Brazil, where I'm from, but here it's a big concern.
What are some of the things that, the everyday person, what can we do to support smart and sustainable transportation? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So basically, what we do is, in terms of we are as a, I would say, traffic transportation engineer or smart mobility solution expert. We look into, innovative designs and how it can help the general public. And what we do is basically we look for those solutions for public, so that not only that we discourage basically people to use only one mode of transportation, and I'm talking about cars only, and instead of that we encourage them to use public transit, active transportation. So there are many things that we do, and many infrastructure that we develop, as an industry, that can help the general public to use other modes of transportation. And what it does, it creates a safe community. It creates a smart and sustainable community. So it's a win-win situation for all of us, that we not only are utilizing our existing infrastructure for all these growths, and we are optimizing their uses, and we are basically saving a lot of time, lot of money, because we are not expanding, we are not adding highway lanes, we are not adding additional traffic signals along the corridor. So it helps you on the long run. So that basically, when it comes to public, they need to understand that if they would adopt these strategies, which are multimodal, and nowadays lots of people do that. It's
They
not
do.
that you and I are not relying just on one mode of transportation these days.
No.
So that's the benefit, and that's where we like to see people going. One other thing that I like to add very quickly is that young people, Generation Z or Z, they prefer not to drive. They prefer not to get their driving license. They prefer to use transit. They prefer to use bicycles, which is good. So, and that's why we are evolving as well, in terms of designing and managing and operating such systems to address their needs.
Do you think it should be up to the manufacturers to create the infrastructure? When you look at Tesla, they have the Tesla superchargers. There's the Volkswagens of the world, and there's the other Honda and Toyota. I guess, when you look at it, when you have the Essos and the Petro-Canada, they don't have their own make and models of cars. So I guess throwing it out there, do you think that there should be maybe universal charging, and should it be up to the manufacturer to work, with these?
Yeah, I mean, and you raised Tesla, and Tesla's an interesting example, because if you look at their whole business model was predicated, I mean, they're a new car company. Their only product is electric vehicles. So for their business model to work, they need to have they absolutely need to build out their own infrastructure. They weren't saying to government, "Oh, well, we're building an electric car, but you build out the infrastructure for us." But I think for traditional automakers that are involved in this transition, it's hugely capitally expensive to make that transition, to build the vehicles, to build the batteries to support the vehicles. That by and large, manufacturers don't look at it as their job to put the infrastructure in place as well. You have seen some exceptions to that. So Volkswagen, for instance, had a ownership stake, I think they still do, in Electrify America, Electrify Canada, which is responsible for building out some infrastructure. It's not their own particular brand per se, like Tesla is, but those stations would be open to any other EV as well. But that's more the exception than the norm. Typically, what happens is that different manufacturers will collaborate with charging station providers, whether it's Flow or ChargePoint or what have you, to say, okay, well, we've struck an agreement with our with a charging station provider. When a consumer buys their vehicle, that they might get a discounted rate or a certain number of kilometers free with their particular charging station provider. But the real challenge is just there's too many different types of charging station providers out right now as well, which would be no problem if they all sort of operated the same way, and you could pay by credit card, but that's not the
Right.
norm. The norm is that every charging station seems to have a different app that you have to download, and you need a different card that you might need, so you can have a wallet full of cards, and
You need the adapter to go along with it. Yeah.
Some want you to put a deposit down, so that so this sort of thing. So it's certainly not convenient for consumers, the charging infrastructure that we have right now, for sure. And the other challenge that I've experienced myself is just the uptime of the charging infrastructure. There's nothing more frustrating to an EV driver to have 40 kilometers left and go to a fast charger somewhere, only to find out that, oh, gee whiz, it's not working. And then you might be hard pressed to find another station that you can get to with the limited range that you still have on your vehicle. So I know that's something we've been encouraging the federal government in their new contracts, where they're trying to encourage doing RFPs for the installation of charging infrastructure. That part of that RFP would be an uptime requirement, so that these charging stations are maintained, and there is a performance metric built into that contract.
From innovation to creating new processes to support EV adoption, I hope you got a lot of takeaways from these guests. This podcast is sponsored by Smart Energy, an energy conference that is held annually in Halifax and in Vancouver. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. Thanks for listening in today.